impervious cover limits, building coverage limits. So anything that isn't expressly in conflict would just continue to apply as normally. Next slide. To implement the new state laws, site development standards, some of Austin's land development code standards have to be modified. First is compatibility. The first height limit, which is currently set at 40 feet, would be increased to 45 feet for qualifying projects. And you can see an image of what that would look like in what the height limit I'm referencing in the diagram. City capital view corridors, the greater would apply, whether the CBC height limit or 45 feet, whichever one was greater, would it be applicable. And then for waterfront overlay, the lesser applies of the setback established by the waterfront overlay over 25 feet. Waterfront overlay setbacks are not considered environmental setbacks, and so they would be subject to SB 840. And in most cases, the 25 feet will be the lesser amount. Next slide. So the application of subchapter E regulations is a little bit more complicated. Whether regulation continues to apply is based on how the applicability table in subchapter E, section 1.2.1, assigns that regulation to a zoning district or a use, and it depends on what kind of zoning district or use. So we'll be walking through a couple of examples. For qualifying projects, subchapter E regulations would continue to apply if section 1.2.1 applies the regulation to all zoning districts or non-residential zoning districts. So i.e. commercial or industrial, but industrial doesn't apply in this case because you can't use SB 840 on most industrial sites. So all zoning or commercial zoning districts. And I emphasize zoning districts because commercial uses are handled differently. So all zoning districts or commercial zoning districts would continue to apply. An example of this is in the top box, which I know is kind of hard to see. There's a lot of, the table is pretty wide. And, but this is an excerpt of table 1.2.1. And it applies, sorry, it's too small for me even to see. That's not helpful. Okay, sorry. The relationship, and if they are applicable to suburban roadways, then it would apply to all commercial zoning districts. And then if it is a development of 5 acres or more, it's applicable to all zoning districts. So those are two examples of that language and how it's, where that distinction is. And then subchapter E regulations also apply to SB 840 projects if the regulation is applied to multifamily residential uses. The bottom example shows that private common open space is applicable to all multifamily use, of how that use is called out as being applicable here. Next slide. In the same manner, for qualifying projects, there are certain regulations that do not apply. If table 1.2.1 applies the regulation to a commercial or non-residential use, then it would only be applicable to a building that is either 100% commercial or the portion of the building that is commercial. So if you have ground floor, it would be applicable to the ground floor commercial, but it wouldn't be applicable to 100% residential project or 100% residential buildings or the residential portion of any building. An example of this is shade and shelter requirements that are only applicable to non-residential land uses. Also, for SB 840 projects that are not utilizing the bonus entitlements in the VMU program, those requirements would not be applicable. So here in the bottom excerpt, you can see that it talks about requirements for mixed use and participation in the VMU project. And so if you're not actually using VMU to get your multifamily or mixed use in a commercial zone, if you're just using SB 840, you would not have to comply with those regulations in subchapter E. However, for projects who do want the additional entitlements that VMU provides, they would be subject to the requirements in subchapter E applicable to VMU. So if you want the VMU bonus, you have to do the VMU standards even with the passage of SB 848. And then last but not least, there are also regulations that SB 840 did not modify. That would include the historic landmarks, regulations protecting historic landmarks and local historic districts, and regulations for environmental features. That includes critical water quality zones, critical environmental features, water quality transition zones, FEMA floodplains, and erosion hazard zones. Those all continue to apply as normal. And with that, that is the end of the presentation. And we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Lindy. Appreciate you and appreciate the information that you were able to give us. I'll remind folks that this presentation is being recorded, and I went ahead and put in the chat a link to where we will be posting a copy of the recording of the presentation, along with a copy of the presentation itself. And that is www.austinTexas.gov/page/public-meetings. And we do have quite a few folks tuned in today. So I'll try my best to run through the questions that we are receiving as they're being received. Again, if you have any questions, if you can please use the Q&A feature that helps us keep track of which questions have been answered and which ones are still pending. Lindy, we went through this one pretty quickly, and I hadn't clicked next while we were doing. So some of the folks asked us if we can go back to the historic landmark chat slide. So I'll go ahead and leave for a little bit because I ran by that one pretty quickly. And so that way folks can go ahead and take a look at it. The other thing I'll say is that, in addition to that, I went ahead and opened up the chat. The chat kind of helps me figure out some of the troubleshooting in terms of technology, but the Q&A really does help me keep track of which ones have been answered and which ones have not been answered. One of the questions that we have from one of our participants is, and I think you addressed it already, Lindy, was whether we can download the map that was shown in the industrial buffer zone. We said that for now that's internal, correct, and that can be through an appointment. Is that correct, Lindy?
Thank you. Yes, unfortunately it's not available to download. We are working internally to see if we can get one that's available for the public. It's sensitive since some of these sites are somewhat protected sites, and so we have to be careful about how we share them. But we are working on something along those lines. Until then, you can make an appointment with our development services staff, and they will be able to help you determine if you're within the buffer.
Okay. All right, one of our attendees is wanting to confirm if there is a structured parking garage that the square footage doesn't count toward the gross square footage for the 65% rule.
That is correct. 25.121 defines gross floor area as any site that's any part of an enclosed building that is over 6 feet, but it does have exceptions, and parking is one of them, and so we don't count parking in for most multifamily. There is some that does count parking, but for most multifamily, it does not include the parking, and so it would not be counted towards the 65% rule.
Gotcha. And does that include, the next question is the parking, what if the parking is shared between residential and non-residential?
So again, this is done by site. The 65% is calculated per site, as opposed to previously um, when we applied subchapter E prior to SB 840, it was the usage percentage was calculated per building. Now it's per site. So if you have a completely residential building and a completely commercial building all on one site and they share parking in between, as long as the commercial building is only 35% and the residential is 65%, it qualifies for SB 840, and the parking is not counted towards the gross